National Puerto Rican Bar Association, established to meet the question on a national basis: what is Puerto Rico? A nation, a state, or something in between? Join the conversation every week right here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tony Suarez. I am the chairman of the National Puerto Rican Conference and Moot Court competition and host of this show. And with me is Steve Alsina, who is my co-host on all the shows that we've been doing up to this point. Steve is not a lawyer. He is not a minister, but he is the voice of the people. He's here directly, and his point is to try to make sure that when we get these lawyers or these ministers on the different shows that we're doing, that we keep ourselves grounded so that it's understood. So, Steve, thanks for joining me once again.
You're welcome, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Yes, I am the one that keeps you guys in line. Why? Because sometimes you get too technical. But that's all good because
That's all good.
That's when we learn.
Well, we have a
That's what we
special, very special guest
Yes.
with us today, and I would
Yes,
like
we
to
do.
bring on the gentleman whom is the most amazing author, a prolific writer, a brilliant gentleman. I happen to have met personally while we were in Puerto Rico for a Somos conference. For those of you who don't know, in Puerto Rico, there's something called the Somos El Futuro conference.
Yeah, the
And
future.
we met as we were both panelists there. I was looking for our pictures, Nelson, but but I couldn't find it. But Nelson Dennis, let's be introduced who this gentleman is, right? An attorney, an author, a film director, and former representatives to the New York State Assembly. From 1997 through 2000, Dennis represented in New York's 68th Assembly District, which includes East Harlem, Spanish Harlem, neighborhoods, both uh, populated Latinos and Latinos from that in that district. He also an award as a writer, film director, and former New York State Assemblyman. As I said, his award-winning films premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and screened throughout the United States and Puerto Rico. His editorials for the New York Daily News and El Diario, over 300 of them, won awards for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. He's a writer of 8 feature-length screenplays, the director of featured films, including Vote for Me, and the author of the book, The World Against All Puerto Ricans. Now, let me tell you something. Not only that, he studied at Harvard University undergraduate and got his law degree from Yale University. So we're talking about a scholar, an eminent, brilliant man who's been involved in the community. He understands his Puerto Rican roots and is still involved with our community. But we're here to talk so let's just say welcome, Dennis. Thank you for joining us.
Real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure is ours.
I like to talk and give some background, and this is why we invited you, because your book is significant, I think, for the history of what we're trying to do with the National Puerto Rican Bar Association. And I'm going to be putting up a couple of banners underneath us. We have a coming Moot Court competition and the National Puerto Rican Bar Association conference, of which this podcast is part of it. And what we're trying to look at is where's the future of Puerto Rico? But before we could talk about the future of Puerto Rico, we must talk about the past of Puerto Rico in order to have a real good understanding. And by the way, the Moot Court competitions, while they are restricted, they're limited to who can argue, of course, being law students. Everyone in the community is free to come and watch these arguments. This is be the 5th one. We've had 4 previous Moot Court competitions. They were always free for the community to come and watch. It's really exciting to see young people coming out, really understanding the Territorial Clause, what it means. It's really exciting to watch them, talk about stuff that they know they're not studying in the constitutional law classes at school. So for those of us who look at Puerto Rico as con amor, I myself, of course, like Dennis, was an ex-New Yorker. I moved down to Florida, and I became a New York State, a Florida State representative, House of Representatives. So we followed similar paths, and now I teach at Florida A&M, and I've retired from the law practice. But we've had this yearning to know we have to do something for Puerto Rico, and so we have to know the past. And I have my own version, of course, my own book of his book, which I loved and watched. I understood his history, and Nelson, I was wondering if you would discuss with us or give us your opinion. I know Puerto Rico has to go forward, but before we go forward, we have to go back. What was your take, and what is the take of your book about what happened to Puerto Rico when it became a possession of the United States?
Well, it basically and the phrasing of it is not mine. It's that of Don Pedro Albizu Campos. What happened? The way that Puerto Rico came under the umbrella of the United States, wasn't so much a peace treaty. It was a real estate transaction. In 1898, when the United States went in, it was a very quick resolution, and there was the United States, Puerto Rico, Philippines, and then fairly complete dominion over Cuba, and it was considered a very quick and wonderful war, and that was initiated under dubious circumstances, as we recall, as how and who it is that actually bombed the USS Maine to start the war. I'm sorry. Well, when the United States went in, this was in 1898. A very quick succession of events occurred. The following year, the most devastating hurricane of that century, of the 19th century, Huracán San Ciriaco, leveled the island, destroyed the island's coffee crop. The physical infrastructure of Puerto Rico wasn't what it was today, so you can imagine the effect that an island-wide hurricane of a greater category than that of Hurricane Maria would have. I mean, it was literally the strongest hurricane of the entire century, of the 19th century. I mean, this was in 1899, and the U.S. Hurricane Relief was strange. It sent no relief. Instead, the following year, 1900, it created a new set of property taxes that were unprecedented in Puerto Rico, with highly progressive taxes that were property taxes against the levied on the farmers, because that was the principal economic activity in Puerto Rico. 80% of the Puerto Rican economy was agriculture at the time. Today, it's 0.8%. It's literally 1/100 of what it was back then. And these taxes were made it very difficult for the farmer to survive, especially since the year after that. This was a set of taxes basically that were created under the umbrella of the Hollander Act. And the following year, in 1901, the United States devalued the Puerto Rican currency of Puerto Rico, which was of a roughly equivalent buying power internationally as a dollar, but it turned the Spanish peso, which was the currency of Puerto Rico, would no longer be the currency. It was no longer valid. They had to use the U.S. dollar, and every peso had to be turned in in exchange for 60 American cents. So it was just a straight out devaluation and a straight out takeover of the entire economy of 40%. 40% of the net wealth and the holdings of every Puerto Rican were devalued. That was a devaluation, 40%. And concomitantly, the flip side of that is that your debts now were 40% higher, because the currency that you had now was being exchanged at only 60%. So so between the hurricane, property taxes, and the currency devaluation, what you had was this was the equivalent of the Naomi. It was shock capitalism, where the imposing power gives a series of hits to the subordinate power and completely destabilizes its economy. The net result of all this again, a hurricane, a property taxes, currency devaluation, was that the farmers were in desperate need of liquidity. Were doing anything to prevent themselves from going bankrupt and being able to hold on to their farms. Well, the only source of capital on the island at the time was interestingly called the American Colonial Bank. That's the only place you could get loans, and it was interesting. It was like Phil Rizzuto at the money store. Come on down, we have money, no problem. They made these loans really very easy, very convenient to get, and it was the only ones that you could get. And the reason was simple because they didn't want the farmers to repay the loans. They didn't. That's not what they were looking for. They didn't want the return on that capital. They wanted the underlying value. They wanted the land, and it worked. There was there uh, there was no uh, what there was no way to regulate the interest. There was no usury law legislation. United Puerto Rico was not allowed to legislate on its own behalf, although it had been before, just before when in 1898, because Puerto Rico had convened its own legislature and Spain had given it that right. Well, Puerto Rico could no longer do that. So without usury law, any usury law relief, the American Colonial Bank could charge whatever it wanted, and so the result of this was the loans weren't able to be repaid, and they got the land. And within one generation, when Nelson Miles, the commanding general of the invading forces, and it was an invasion, it was a takeover of Puerto Rico, he hoisted Old Glory up the town flagpole in Ponce and declared that we come here not to impose upon ourselves. We come here to protect your property and your way of life and to give you the benefits of enlightened civilization. Well, 30 years later, Puerto Ricans were scratching their heads, wondering what those benefits were and what kind of civilization had taken them over. Because by 1930, the United States owned 80% of the arable agricultural land in Puerto Rico. 80%, and it turned a previously diversified, self-sustaining economy of because Puerto Ricans were basically feeding themselves, and that was their economy. And it was appropriate to have an agrarian economy at that time in 1900. It worked for them, and we're talking pineapples, molasses, sugar, tobacco, coffee, all sorts of fruits and vegetables. Now it was turned into a one crop cash cow economy, that of sugar, and the United States was the owner of it, and it was they had economies of scale throughout. They turned it into basically a sugar one crop sugar factory throughout the island, and this land was owned or organized into what was called centrales, and the four largest centrales: East Puerto Rico Sugar, Fajardo, Guanica. I forget the fourth one. The four largest centrales owned half of that 80%, half of the entire holdings, and it was an extraordinary and extraordinarily quick conversion of the entire Puerto Rican economy. And the first governor of the first U.S. civilian governor of Puerto Rico, Charles Herbert Allen, was the one that set the template. He was the only governor for 14 months, and when he handed in the first year's fiscal report to then U.S. President McKinley, it wasn't so much a fiscal report. It was a map for how to take over the entire U.S. economy, and that's what Allen did. 2 weeks after handing in that report, he quit. He resigned as governor, went up to Wall Street, and he got a position as vice president at a major commercial bank. And within 10 years, Charles Herbert Allen was treasurer, then president, then chairman of the board of the American Refining Company. The American Refining Company, that was the name of it, which a part of which today is known as Domino Sugar, just a part of the American Sugar Refining Company.
Really?
His name was Charles Herbert Allen, first governor of Puerto Rico. And so He was basically the first sugar king of Puerto Rico. He hardwired the Puerto Rico economy. He had hired over 600 expats, U.S. expats, most of whom didn't speak Spanish, into the Puerto Rican government bureaucracy to run, to basically run the economy. And in exchange for getting their I mean, they didn't really have to be very effective because they didn't speak Spanish. So, how effective could they be at their specific jobs? However, they were effective at this. They gave them riparian rights, sole source contracts, advance information, the ability to aggregate lots of land without restriction. They returned the favor by giving him all sorts of competitive advantages. Much like Trump, calling his people to paint the reflecting pool or whatever else has been going on in
In Washington now, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
so it's the same business model,
Yeah.
and so he became the first sugar king of Puerto Rico. And when Wall Street saw what this man was able of doing for himself, that was the beginning of a wave of carpetbaggers that have been ever since that have coming to Puerto Rico. There's been a red carpet stretching from Wall Street to San Juan ever since Charles Herbert Allen, and this has been the pattern, the economic pattern between the United States and Puerto Rico. When Albizu Campos, now this was by 1930. Now, what happened in the 30s? Well, you have the Great Depression. So now Puerto Rico is feeding an economic engine that is running on fumes, and the impact that it had on Puerto Rico is that they started squeezing further and further and reducing wages to the point where people that were once that once owned their own land, were working on it, now were basically landless peasants. That's why they were treated as, because they had no power, no organization, no ability to legislate on their own behalf. And it got to the point where Puerto Ricans were now beginning to starve and not be able to feed their own families, ironically, by working on what used to be their own land. It was within this framework, within this context, that Pedro Albizu Campos entered the historical landscape of Puerto Rico. The first Puerto Rican to graduate from Harvard Law School. People who follow this, they know his story. He was a brilliant man, spoke six languages, and he was essentially a very peaceful man. He had no problem coexisting with the United States.
I may add that he was also an ROTC cadet, became a lieutenant in the United States Army.
Yeah, he was a lieutenant, and he helped train and sorry, I'm just reading a note that was given to you. Give me one moment. Okay, all right. So thank you, Yordi. Someone was helping me set up over here.
Okay.
Talk to you later, Yordi. When I'm done. Okay. And so now we're in the Great Depression. There was an island-wide agricultural strike, and of the sugarcane workers, those macheteros, and they found out that their own union leadership, and this is something that has happened over and over in Puerto Rico, and it's happening within the alleged two-party system of Puerto Rico, both of whom cut their own leadership, end up cutting their own deals with the United States, and not on behalf of Puerto Rico, but basically on behalf of themselves. The FLT, the Federación Liberación de Trabajadores, the FLT leadership, which was the sugar cane cutters union, was negotiating. The workers found, the rank and file discovered that during the strike, that their leadership was cutting deals on behalf of themselves in San Juan with the sugarcane owners, and it is at that point that they approached the sugar workers approached Albizu Campos and the Nationalist Party. Now, Albizu was one of the founders of the Nationalist Party, and by this point he was the president of the party by 1930, and he had been for almost 15 years. He had been advocating, editorializing. He had traveled throughout the Caribbean and South America on behalf of the Nationalist Party, and basically saying we have no problem coexisting with the United States. What we don't agree with is that the United States has a right to have its hand in both our pockets because we're not able to survive, and that's exactly what the strike was about. And so they came to the rank and file came to Albizu Campos and asked him, "Could you become the leader? Could you take charge? Could you help coordinate the strike?" And he agreed. He did it reluctantly at first. He said, "You understand that you're going to inherit the the historic profiles, the baggage that comes with the Nationalist Party, that we're not perceived favorably by the United States, although the United States really didn't care much up until the strike, because it was never until that moment that Pedro Albizu Campos had affected their pocketbook. But the strike went off. Albizu was an effective negotiator, an excellent organizer. Even his military training into play when he helped coordinate the physical aspects of that strike. And basically, he was able to, by the end of it, he negotiated nearly a tripling of the wages to 12 cents an hour at that time, from 4 cents an hour to 12 cents an hour, and that margin was the difference between starvation and people being able to feed their families or not across the island of Puerto Rico. And that's what, and it's at that point that became a turning point. There was a sharp. There was a before the strike and after the strike in the way that the United States treated the Puerto Ricans, because what the U.S. then is immediately started to militarize the entire power structure in Puerto Rico. They brought in a new governor named Blanton Winship, he had no background in diplomacy or economics, legislation, or economic development. He was a general, a U.S. general who understood power and fear and subjugation of native populations. And it is at that point that Puerto Ricans started to becoming treated as military opponents by the United States. Within short order is when you had in 1935 the Ponce massacre, in which 19 innocent Puerto Ricans were killed, slaughtered on Palm Sunday in Ponce. And so that gives you, and this was under the with the say-so under the tutelage of Governor Blanton Winship. And they also brought a new chief of police, E. Francis Riggs, who was a military intelligence officer, to become the head of the police force. And now the police force was no longer the insular police was no longer just consisted of locals, because it was difficult to have. Puerto Rico was very small and very, it was like, in a sense, a collection of neighborhoods and a collection of families, and it was difficult for the insular police to be beating on their own cousins and family members and people that they knew. So they had to bring in outside agents. They had to bring outside police officers and FBI agents and Tommy gunners. And there was the Tommy gunners that was the principal, the front line in the Ponce massacre. So I mean, it was a whole entirely new type of police force. And so basically, what we turned from a model of supposed development of Puerto Rico to outright state-sponsored terrorism against the Puerto Rican population. This was after the successful sugarcane strike of 1934. So now this is where we start approaching now the model that became the framework for the U.S. Commonwealth. Give it a few years, another decade goes by, and it becomes increasingly obvious to people, anyone that was looking, although Puerto Rico was sort of off the map. And this is one of the themes in my book, that Puerto Rico was like, if you remember the movie Chinatown, where at the end they say, "Forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown." Forget everything that happened. Just keep it out of mind. And the theme is that what happens in Las Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas.
Mhm.
Or what happens in Puerto Rico never happened at all, because the world never really heard about it. And still, in a sense, that huge division, that blackout of information still exists today. How often do you hear about Puerto Rico in the U.S. mainstream media, unless there's a hurricane or some
That's true.
devastation? How often is Puerto Rico mentioned in the presidential debates by any of the candidates? And
Yeah.
so this is the condition that existed as we approach 1950 now. United States by that time, after World War II. Oh, and by the way, uh, there's a little military element in this. Puerto Ricans were made U.S. citizens in 1912, exactly 1 month to the day, or 1 month on April 2, 1912. Exactly 1 month before President Woodrow Wilson sent his declaration of war to the to which apparently Trump has failed to do still to the U.S. Congress. Um, and 1 month after Puerto Ricans were made citizens, there was a declaration of war. It was that Wilson made, and 18,000 Puerto Ricans were drafted into the U.S. Army and fought in World War I, and disproportionate numbers to their population on the front lines of this war. But they're U.S. citizens, and when they came back after the war, they said, "Okay, at least there was a lot of deaths, uh, there was a lot of casualties, a lot of mutilated soldiers. But when they came, the ones that survived when they came back said, "Okay, but now we're U.S. citizens." Okay, but lo and behold, under the Territorial and Supremacy Clause of of the U.S. Constitution, which you mentioned earlier, Anthony,
Mhm.
it was found that Puerto Ricans, although U.S. citizens, did not have the inherent power to legislate on their own behalf, and so the United States, Puerto Rico was still unable to insist and create its own minimum wage legislation. And it was on that basis that they were able to raise after World War One. Soldiers come back, and they're still treated as basically as slaves and indentured servants on land that was previously their own. And so that was a situation going forward. Puerto Rico was just straight out an expropriated U.S. colony. Now we're in the framework of the Cold War after World War II, where again you had soldiers went in. They were known as the Borinqueneers. That's a whole story unto itself, how they were treated during the World War II and during the Korean War. All right, so now we're in the 50s, and
And you haven't even spoken about the experiments and the doctor that was experimenting on Puerto Rican women.
yeah. At one point, Puerto Rico had the highest sterilization rate in the entire world. It was 1/3 of the population of Puerto Rican women had been sterilized. Many of whom hadn't even known that it had been done, and it was permanent and irreversible. And so that's again a very clear expression of the United States outlook and their view of Puerto Rico, and the Puerto Rican people. They were not only to be dominated and used as economic units, but the population was to be controlled outright. Um, that's a very strong human statement. So now you're
Yeah,
into the
it is a strong human statement, and I urge people. You've said a lot of things, and your book is lengthy, but I encourage everyone to look at order the book. All right, read it and understand. And we're gonna go into the future. I don't want this to be all about the past, but you cannot understand the future without understanding the past. And what Nelson has put forth in his book is documented. What he's saying is not something he believes. Okay, it's something that actually happened because he did the research. And in his book, by the way, you have many photographs from the time period and newspaper articles, which he included, so that you can do your own research if you want, and to verify the claims that he's made about what happened with Puerto Rico's occupation. I think that it's no doubt whatsoever that Puerto Rico was taken by the United States, of course, as part of the Treaty of Paris, and became a possession. And then they tried to abuse it. He just indicated with the first governor Allen, they turned it into a colony of just sugar. and then they totally confiscated the properties of all the owners, and then they became just workers. And ultimately, when there was an attempt to try to get some equality, led by the Nationalist Party at that time, that then the oppression came, and the oppression is long, is detailed, and that is in fact the history of Puerto Rico. That being said, okay, and I, again, urge you to look at the book because it's important. What I'd like for you to address, Don Nelson, is going to go forward. You live in the United States. You've made a living here. What is your advice for the island? Because ultimately, they have had several plebiscites. They come and they split them, and there's no decision as to where the islanders want to go. It is clear. On the other hand, nothing that they do, whether they vote for statehood or independence or anything else, it's not effective because they have no vote. It has to come from Congress. So, you know, you're a politician. You've worked the streets. You understand the people. You're a historian. Tell us where you think this is going to go.
Well, a lot of that it will derive from the solution that the United States created for itself right around the 1950s. Let me make. I just want to cover one period there, because I think that's what propels us right now into the future. As I was saying, that we're now into the 50s after the war, and the United States now was locked in a battle with Russia for basically for world leadership, and the United States was positioning itself as the leader of the free world, because the United States, as a matter of public relations, could ill afford to declare itself the leader of the free world when it was also the owner of the only existing currently existing colony on the whole planet. You know, how are you going to lead the free world if you still have your own colony, Puerto Rico? So what the United States needed to do was to get the UN to take Puerto Rico off what was called a decolonization list in the UN, that of a country that needed to be decolonized, that under the tutelage and under the watchful eye of the entire world and of the United Nations. And in order to do that, they needed to create a new framework, a new filter for the world to look at Puerto Rico. And that's where they passed what was called Public Law 600, which created the first plebiscite. And then the plebiscite gave the choices of state independence or Estado Libre Asociado, free.
It's a pacto bilateral, ¿verdad? That you heard so much from the right.
And free associate state, Estado Libre Asociado, which is a misnomer in several ways, because Puerto Rico is not a state, it is not free, and since it has no independent existence, it has no position from which to associate or not associate. So ELA is a misnomer, across the board. Exacto, but it was an intentional misnomer, so that the United States could then say, Puerto Rico, of its own free will, has voted for this Commonwealth, and have a freely associated relationship with the United States as its own Commonwealth. And the principal architect of that was not Luis Muñoz Marín, who, and it was during that time the United States could say, oh, hey, we also by way of showing that Puerto Rico has its own development, has its own existence, and they're masters of their own fate. We have the first Puerto Rican governor. Well, sure, but it was the first Puerto Rican governor, Luis Muñoz Marín, who then helped position and propose this and structure this new relationship. And he went, but he wasn't all that. He actually, there's an interview of his that you can still see on YouTube. It was in a show called Washington Merry-Go-Round, which was the top political political interview show in the United States at the time. It was on television, and you can still see the interview. It's about 45 minutes long, with Governor Luis Muñoz Marín after the October 1950 October 50 revolution that was attempted by the nationalists.
Nelson,
Well, let me repeat that. It's called
what was
Washington
the-
Merry-Go-Round, Drew Pearson, and it's on YouTube. So here's what happened when José Marín became the one of the principal advocates, but his attorney general José Trias Monge, he was the smart guy. So the nationalists had their own smart guy, Pedro Albizu Campos, Harvard Law School. Well, José Trias Monge graduated from Yale Law School, and he was the smart guy who basically drafted, conceived, and advocated before the UN and before congressional subcommittees on behalf of this Commonwealth framework that they were proposing. And interestingly enough, José Trias Monge, that very man, had a deathbed conversion. We were talking about this earlier, Tony, where he wrote a book published by the Yale University Press called Puerto Rico, Trials of the Last Colony in the World. That was the title that José Trias Monge himself gave his own book, where the central tenet of that book, and it's very well written, very well documented. And I try in my book, I tried to do the same thing. My book is basically two books. It's the text, which I tried to make readable, so that people, because a book that is not read is like a book that doesn't exist. So, I focus on making it very, very readable and interesting for the reader. But the second book in War Against All Puerto Ricans is the footnotes. There's over 700 footnotes because, as you said, Tony, there's a lot of subject matter here that needed to be documented since it's inherently controversial. Well, José Trias Monge's book is the same way. It's deeply annotated, well sourced by a primary source, himself, the principal architect of this relationship, and he himself disavows it in this book. He says outright, there was no inherent status change. There was no change in the political and socioeconomic relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. The entire reasons for this was so the United States could go forward before the entire world. It was a public relations maneuver so that the United States could still position itself as the leader of the quote unquote free world. But the whole intent was to have no change whatsoever in the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, but with a new name, that of a Commonwealth. And that's what happened in 1950. And that's why I wanted to take this moment, Anthony, to bring us forward to where we are today. So because that was the genesis, that was the original intent and the continuing reality of the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. Because, as you said, Congress has unique and plenary jurisdiction over Puerto Rico, and under the territorial and supremacy clauses of the U.S. Constitution. You are absolutely right. You can have every clemency. You had all these votes until you're blue in the face, but it doesn't matter because it's Congress that decides. Right. Even if 100% of every single Puerto Rican voted for independence, it would mean nothing because it is Congress that has the right under international law, under established constitutional law right now, to say Puerto Rico is going to be independent. It is Orwellian that the world doesn't fully understand the meaning of this, and that's why I'm hoping that this kind of discussion and these moot court competitions that it takes on that it catches fire, so that people can look under just a little peek under the curtain and see that there is a deeply inhumane and misunderstood relationship here that needs to be corrected.
That is a perfect segue to what I wanted to talk about, which is the next thing, which is that moot court competition. Part of the conference that we're having in September, as I indicated earlier, has to do with lawyers and continuing legal education that we're offering to lawyers if they come. But the big part of it is this moot court competition. This is going to be our fifth moot court competition, and it's going to turn, as you see in the flyer. Does the representation made by the United States in the United Nations conflict with the rulings of the United States Supreme Court on the colonial status of Puerto Rico? Because it's about that. The actual fact pattern, we haven't divulged it because the schools are not going to get that until just 3 weeks before the moot court, because they have to prepare their briefs and then they argue. But the whole point, as you brought up well, is that we have to teach about the Territorial Clause. In law schools, They teach you about the structure, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. You learn about the amendments and how they applied, but you don't learn about the Territorial Clause because it's just the course itself. The books are like 1,500 pages. It's a 2-semester class. It's a huge class, a big class, but too much to cover. They don't cover the Territorial Clause, and no one understands it. Okay? Even judges don't understand how to interpret the court. So there are lots of cases that go on. And what we hoping to do with Moot Court, Dennis, is to bring attention to this situation, because unless we have allies in Montana and Utah who have congressmen and senators who can get a bill passed to give Puerto Ricans an opportunity to actually have a binding vote, it's not going to happen. Nothing is going to happen without our assistance. And that means that people who are not Puerto Ricans have more power over the future of Puerto Ricans than Puerto Ricans themselves. And that requires quite a bit of work. And so that's what our purpose of the Moot Court, that's what this podcast is about. And by the way, just to be cautious, everyone understand, none of the bar associations who are participating, that is Illinois, New York, Puerto Rico, and Florida, support any particular solution for Puerto Rico. No one says it should be independent or should be a state. They all do, however, agree that the current status, which is basically a colony, they control their budget, they have, promesa, which is another 20 peso, como se dice, ¿verdad? And so they don't control their future. The island is in the demographic winter. People are moving out, and there's going to be eventually not enough people on this island. I mentioned in my notes, I wanted to discuss about Bad Bunny's song about Hawaii, and perhaps you could make a comment on that. But if we on the mainland don't bring this to the attention, it will not be an issue, and Puerto Rico will basically die out. So that's what we're doing. And, again, I want to thank you for even putting your time, and you're a busy man, and you're giving some effort. So perhaps you could comment on the question of Bad Bunny, or what the diaspora could do.
Well, I can give you, interestingly, and I'm glad that you brought that, because that segues into something that's happened to me. The power of the diaspora and of getting information out, and of events such as this Moot Court competition, how critical they are. It turns out, just by chance, I'm not promoting myself or anything, but just since you mentioned Bad Bunny, there was one photograph of him. He apparently, unbeknownst to me, read the Spanish translation, Guerra contra todos los puertorriqueños, the Spanish translation of my book. He apparently had it in his hand. Here somewhere in New York, and someone took a photograph of it, and it went on social media.
We're viral.
Because of that one photograph, Tony, the sales for about 4 months, the sales of my book quintupled because of that one photo. So that is the power of media, and that is the power of getting the word out through other creative means. So so basically, there's like a media blackout. There's it's like an information hole it's just a black hole. Whatever goes in there doesn't really get out. The information doesn't get out properly. So if one photograph can have such a tremendous impact, imagine what a very coordinated, very well detailed and documented discussion that hopefully starts going amplifies and goes worldwide. And events such as this Moot Court competition are the fire that gets it going. So I think it's fantastic.
Great. I appreciate your endorsement of that concept. And once again, we endorse your wonderful work that you're doing. And I Steve, if you'd like to, we're out our time. We got 2 minutes. Can you'd like to say something? Because you've been kind of quiet.
Well, my friend, I have been listening to Mr. Nelson Denis, which it is amazing the amount of information and true life in the history of the Puerto Rican people. So yeah, I was paying a lot of attention to everything and learning a lot of stuff. I understand that you made several movies, Denis. Would you mind telling us those?
about those two movies. All right, and I'll do it very quickly. There was, one was called "Vote for Me." It was a story of a 70-year-old building super in East Harlem. I mean, I made it up, but it was actually based on someone that I knew. That he decided to run for Congress in East Harlem. That didn't happen, but I know a guy who did something like that. He worked for me when I was assemblyman, and he tried to stop. Some guys were selling drugs on the corner near my office, and so he got into a fight with them. A physical fist fight with them, which was very brave, but was not the way to not the profile, not the way to approach that problem.
Yeah.
I said, Leo, you can't. I mean, I approve, but we can't have, that assemblyman is going on and they're beating up people. So I said, but I'm gonna do something like it. And one day I did. And the movie is called Vote for Me, and it's a story of a 70-year-old building super that runs for Congress with only one promise, one campaign promise, and he delivers on it. That if he gets elected, he's going to go up to every drug dealer in East Harlem and kick them in the butt. And that's what he does. That's what, and it's called Vote for Me, and it premiered at Tribeca Film Festival, and it played in throughout the country. That's what the other one, the second one that I wrote and directed. It's a feature film. It's called Make America Great Again, and it's a spoof. The title is a spoof because it's about a fellow who comes from Santo Domingo to help his sister who has asthma, and he comes here looking for work. A decent guy, but he hears about this guy in New York, and basically it's a story of this guy that gets chased all over New York City by ICE for almost half the movie, and that's what's called Make America Great Again. And actually, it got distributed by Caribbean cinemas in theaters in Puerto Rico. So I was really happy to say that the financial investment, I was able to make my money back on thanks to Caribbean cinemas. Because they distributed the movie, and so it's just awesome. My own way of bringing some of these issues to light. And thank you for asking about it.
And no, my pleasure. Thank you. To Make America Great. When did you make that movie?
Which one?
The Make America Great. Make America Great Again.
About 4 years ago, and it got distributed 3 years ago in Puerto Rico.
Well, once again, thank you so much,
Really good.
Nelson. Thank you for joining us. It's going to be a great show. I will post this immediately on our website of the National Puerto Rican Bar Association. And if you get a chance, talk to other lawyers and let them know what's going on down here in Florida.
Thank you, Anthony. It was my pleasure to come on board, and anything you can count on me to help promote this activity, and anything that you do in the future, include me. I'll be glad to help.
Thank you so much. All right, God bless. Bye-bye.
Okay.
See you next week, everybody.
Gracias.
Gracias a ti. Thank you.